opportunity to welcome Professor Marcus Wissen to this guest seminar today. Marcus Wissen is Professor of Social Sciences with a focus on socio-ecological transformation at the Berlin School of Economics and Law in Berlin, Germany. His teaching and research focuses upon the society-nature relations, the imperial mode of living, and the labour-ecology nexus. He is a member of the editorial board of PROCLA, that is the Zeitschrift für kritische Sozialwissenschaft, and also a member of the scientific advisory board for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. His recent publications include with Ulrich Brand, The Imperial Mode of Living, Everyday Life, and the Ecological Crisis of Capitalism, which was published by Verso Books in the UK in 2021. And forthcoming in 2025, I think autumn, is Capitalism at the Limit, a Political Ecology of a World Crisis, again with Ulrich Brand. And this will be published by politicize in the UK. The topic of Marcus's presentation today is everyday life and the ecological crisis of capitalism. And without further ado, I will pass the floor to Marcus for the presentation.
Many thanks to Peter for a very kind introduction, and many thanks to the organizer for the invitation for this lecture. I'm happy to be here. I cannot say here, we are in many sites, and I'm happy to participate from Berlin in this seminar discussion. Yes. So as Peter already said, the imperial mode of living, everyday life, and the ecological crisis of capitalism is the topic of my presentation. And I would like to start with two observations. The one is based on the UNEP emissions gap report that was published at the end of last year. UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, publishes these emissions gap reports regularly before the United Nations, before the conference of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change and the Paris Protocol. And in this emission gap report, it is said that, or it's shown that the global greenhouse gas emission reached a new record in 2023 with 57.1 gigatons CO2 equivalents. That's a new record, and that is of course a very bad development. The report also there's an outlook, and it sketches the perspectives for the 21st century. There will be a global warming of possibly 3.1% in case of a business as usual, a global warming of 2.6 degrees if the states achieve their current NDCs, that are the nationally determined contributions that the states have to report to the Climate Secretariat of the UNFCCC, or a global warming of 1.9 degrees if states achieve their climate neutrality targets. Yeah. The climate neutrality targets are usually given for the mid of the century. For example, Europe, the European Union, wants to be climate neutral by 2050, China by 2060, Germany by 2045. Yeah. So if this is realized, there might be a chance to achieve the 1.9 degrees target. That is still much above what has been envisaged by the Paris Climate Agreement from 2015. There, states obliged themselves to limit the rise of the global average temperature compared to the pre-industrial age to 1.5 degrees. So this target indeed seems far out of reach. That would be one observation. Another observation is that we are currently facing a kind of fossil backlash. This is a graph from The Guardian from last year. It shows the development of licenses for oil and gas drilling in worldwide, and in particular in 5 wealthy countries, namely Australia, Canada, Norway, the UK, and the United States. So what we can see here is that there is a rise in the granting of the oil and gas drill licenses, and that most of these licenses have been granted in states which are quite wealthy and which do not depend in their economic development on extracting and exporting fossil fuels. In particular, the United States is important here because 83% of the global licenses had been handed out in the wealthy nations, and half of them by the United States. And in the Biden government, 20% more licenses were granted than in the first Trump government. And now Trump has entered his new government period with the announcement, drill, baby, drill. So we can expect what is happening here. That is a very problematic development because that was the first observation. Coping with climate change and combating the climate crisis would need a stop of further oil and gas granting licenses and further drilling and further exploration of oil and gas resources. Yeah. But nevertheless, it goes on. What is the reason for that? Yeah. We all know about the problems. We all know that climate change is largely due to the burning of fossil fuels. Nevertheless, in spite of an aggravating climate crisis, the drilling of fossil fuels has been intensified more recently. What is the reason for that? How can we explain this discrepancy between the knowledge about the climate change and the actual measures and the actual policies of even wealthier states which do not expand on the exploration, extraction, and export of fossil fuels? What are the contradictions of the current situation? And what would be the preconditions, the approach, the points of departure, and the perspectives of a socio-ecological transformation? These are the questions that I would like to address in my presentation. And what I would like to do is to proceed in 3 steps. First, I would like to introduce the concept of the imperial mode of living, which Ulrich Brand and myself consider a kind of explanation of this discrepancy between knowledge about the environmental catastrophe on the one hand and the lack of, or the absence of an appropriate action by political and economic actors on the other hand. That would be my first point. The second point is to take a closer look at the current crisis of the deepening of the crisis of the imperial mode of living. And thirdly, I would like to address competing crisis strategies and the perspectives of a socio-ecological transformation. To come to my first point, the imperial mode of living. As Peter already said, my remarks on this are based on a common book with Ulrich Brand that we published in 2021 with Verso, The Imperial Mode of Living, Everyday Life, and the Ecological Crisis of Capitalism. What is it? What is this imperial mode of living? So it is about unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, which are deeply rooted in everyday perceptions and practices in infrastructures, power relations, institutions, and social structures. So very diverse patterns of production that are based on the use and the burning of fossil fuels, but also of raw materials that cannot be reproduced in the time where they are consumed. Unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, which are based on an unequal appropriation of nature and labor power on a global scale. When we talk about nature, we always mean resources and things. Resources, of course, fossil resources, metals, and also agrarian resources. Things as ecosystems that absorb more of a certain product, a certain substance than they themselves emit to the environment. For example, rainforests in the case of CO2. Unsustainable patterns of production and consumption which produce enormous social and ecological costs and externalize them in space and time, and which therefore cannot be generalized from a socio-ecological point of view. Instead, they presuppose exclusiveness and exclusion. That would be a definition, that would be what we understand as imperial mode of living. Imperial mode of living is a category of hegemony theory. Yeah. So when developing this concept, we, for example, and to a large extent, have drawn on the insights by Antonio Gramsci, who has written a lot about the hegemony of certain power relations. Yeah. And we consider the imperial mode of living as a kind of way to make certain very destructive forms of society-nature relations hegemonic. The imperial mode of living connects, or this category connects, the everyday life of people with overarching social and international structures. It focuses social practices and structural conditions that render their destructive character invisible through externalization. If you look at the car, for example, you cannot see the socio-ecological conditions under which the resources were extracted that were used for its construction. The meat in the supermarkets is silent about the suffering of the animals, about the CO2 emissions in industrial agriculture, and about the working conditions in the meat production. Supermarkets and car dealerships stress completely different aspects of their products: power, masculinity, security, speed, autonomy. That is what is stressed, whereas this destructive character in producing these products is systematically silenced. The imperial mode of living is not an issue of choice. When we published our book in German in 2017, there was a debate on what exactly is the meaning of this category. And some people criticized us for individualizing environmental responsibility, for morally blaming people for their lifestyles. But that is not our intention. The imperial mode of living is not a moral category. It is a structural category. It's a category that points to the embeddedness of certain consumption decisions in social structures and power relations that are fundamentally shaped by mechanisms of capitalist societies. So if you purchase a car, for example, that is an individual decision, but nevertheless, this decision has a history. And often this history is not conscious to the people who take the decision. That is something that we can learn from Pierre Bourdieu and his ideas on habitus and how it influences the decision-making processes and the way people act. So the imperial mode of living is not an issue of choice. It's not an issue of rational consumer behavior. It's more about the social structures which make deeply irrational, deeply destructive forms of consumer behavior rational. In our societies, it is rational to drive a car. It's very rational because you are quicker, you are safer than, for example, or you protect yourself against infections that you might get if you use public transport. You are safer than, for example, bikers or even pedestrians. In cities. You are a danger for others, but the others are not a danger for you. So it's rational to go by car, but nevertheless, from a socio-ecological point of view, it is deeply irrational. For many people, there is no other possibility than using a car. If you live in the countryside, where there is no social and physical infrastructure, where there is no hospital, no leisure facilities, no shops, no schools, no libraries, and where the bus only goes twice a week, you don't have another possibility than using the car. So it's closely connected to social structures. That is the point. That is the point that we have to take into account. So it's not a moral category blaming individuals for consumption decisions, but it is an attempt to understand why certain very destructive consumption and production decisions are taken and how these decisions are rooted in the capitalist character of our societies. the imperial mode of living doesn't only refer to consumption, but also to production. For example, the workers in automotive factories, they, of course, are involved in the imperial mode of living, but they do not have an influence on where the resources come from, which are built into the components they use to construct a car. The workers are structurally involved into the imperial mode of living because of their subaltern status in a capitalist society where they do not have another chance than selling their labor power, even for activities which are socially and environmentally detrimental. As consumers, we cannot check everything that we buy regarding its socio-environmental history. What is the environmental history? How much CO2 emissions have been produced when generating this product? If we tried to check that in every product that we need for our daily lives, we couldn't manage our daily lives. It wouldn't be possible. Yeah? So the imperial mode of living is a constraint. But at the same time, it is highly attractive since it allows for the participation in social wealth and it enhances our spatial reach. The imperial mode of living is thus at the same time a necessity and a promise, a constraint and a precondition of participation in capitalist societies. As already said, the imperial mode of living cannot be generalized. It presupposes exclusiveness, an exclusiveness that is actually secured by an imperialist world order. So imperialism is a very important figure and very important concept to understand the imperial mode of living. They are closely related, yeah. So we refer to theories of imperialism, but we also try to go beyond them or see them from a specific perspective. Roughly spoken, theories of imperialism consider dominance in international relations as a result of military, of economic, of political power, that is, of force that is exerted by certain dominant states vis-à-vis less dominant states. We would agree, but nevertheless, looking only at the force and the let's say, violent or pressure or whatever aspects of imperialism does not reveal the entire nature of this form of domination. So our interest is not only to understand how imperialism works because of power asymmetries, because of the dominance, because of economic, military, and political power, but also in spite of this power, in spite of force. So we are interested in the hegemonic aspects, in the normalization of imperialism in the everyday life of people. And this is where our category, the imperial mode of living, comes in. We would argue that the imperial mode of living kind of normalizes imperialism through externalizing the social and ecological costs of this form of domination and through obscuring these costs through externalizing them to others in space and time. In space, to people in the global south, in time, to future generations, which will be much more affected by the ecological crisis than our generations today. Okay, so far my first point. My second point, the crisis of the imperial mode of living. The problem now is that we are facing aggravating environmental crisis phenomena. The problem is that the mechanism of externalization on which the imperial mode of living essentially depends does not work any longer, or at least it is becoming ever more precarious. This is also due to the fact that ever more societies are dependent on externalizing their socio-ecological costs. Look, for example, at China. China used to be a developing country until the 1970s, and since then it has experienced a very dynamic economic development. The result of this development is an expansion, or let's say an emulation or a spread of consumption patterns, which we were used to know in global northern societies, to China. So there is a spread of unsustainable patterns of consumption in the middle class, upper classes of the Chinese society. And at the same time, we see that certain production patterns produce externalization effects. China, for example, is a very important actor in land grabbing in Africa, in metal extraction in Latin America. It tries to build up infrastructures in the framework or against with the means of its Belt and Road Initiative here. So China itself, like the global northern countries, has become an externalizer, has become dependent on externalizing its social and ecological costs. This is due to its capitalist development, its resource-intensive capitalist development. And that is the problem. Yeah? This development has taken place in times of an aggravating climate crisis. And this climate crisis, the ecological crisis in general, is the game changer. This is the game changer, and it does not mean anything else but that we are confronted with the loss of an external sphere of capitalist societies. The imperial mode of living is based on the exclusiveness, is based on the availability of the existence of an external sphere where social and ecological costs can be shifted to. Now, this sphere is increasingly contested because ever more societies are dependent to access this sphere. And the more it is contested, the more it shrinks. And climate change is a good example for this. The external sphere where we can dispose our CO2 emissions is shrinking. The terrestrial ecosystems like the rainforest have been overstretched for quite a long time. And the atmosphere also is overstretched by this. The CO2 concentrates in the atmosphere with the effect that we are confronted with a global warming. This is nothing else than a crisis of externalization, a crisis of the externalization that's aggravated by the patterns of production and consumption in the global north, by the fact that ever more countries in the global south also are adopting these practices in the context of the global capitalist world market competition. So there is a loss of the external sphere, and this can be seen very clearly when looking at the climate crisis. That is, I would say, the basic contradiction of our time. Through the consolidation and dissemination of the imperial mode of living, capitalism becomes the normality for more and more societies. It becomes deeply entrenched in social relations and social relations of forces, in economic and political institutions, in physical infrastructures, in everyday perceptions. But it is exactly through this normalization that capitalism reaches its ecological limits. This is the background of the debate on the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. So there are further terms for this new epoch that we have been entering right now. But this crisis, I think, is a very important aspect in order to understand the transition towards this new geological epoch that has not been acknowledged as such officially, but nevertheless, the change is very visible. The crisis of the imperial mode of living results into increasing eco-imperial tensions. Tensions for raw materials, fossil fuels, but also metals. They are very important for the ecological modernization of the imperial mode of living, which I'm going to address on the next slide. Tensions about land. Land is becoming ever more important. The crisis of the fossil metabolism means that land is gaining importance regarding as a source of energy or as a source where energy can be produced. Non-capitalist or pre-capitalist forms of societies were largely land-based societies because it was the land, it was the forest the agricultural lands where solar energy was transformed in a way that it could be used by human societies. Then, as the environmental historian Peter Langford has called it, the subterranean forest of coal and oil was used with its high energy density. It became the fuel of the industrialization and of the capitalist expansion and the capitalist creation of the world market. Yeah? And now we are in a transition again. Yeah? Still, we are in a fossil fuel energy regime. Still, the use of fossil fuels is increasing. I started my presentation with that. But nevertheless, we see the crisis, we see the negative effects, and we see that we need land-based resources that help us to get out of this crisis. Yeah. There is an increasing competition about infrastructures, for example, infrastructures for the creation of green hydrogen that is considered very important in order to decarbonize industries. There is a competition for sinks. Yeah. The whole international climate policy, the COPs, the Conference of the Parties that take place at the end of every year, are nothing else than competition or attempts to regulate the competition for sinks, for CO2 sinks. There is an increasing competition for climate adaptation. We know that the climate crisis is happening. So there are certain consequences of this crisis which cannot be prevented any longer, which happen and to which human societies have to adapt. The question is, who has to pay for the adaptation? We know that the most severe consequences of the climate crisis can be felt by the societies in the global south, although the societies of the global north are the main the producers of climate change, are those who are responsibly at first place for this catastrophe. So many countries in the global south demand a compensation. They demand a contribution, a significant contribution of the global north to their measures to adapt to the climate crisis. And the last point that is very contested, and is increasingly contested, we saw that in the last conference of the parties last year in Baku in Azerbaijan, is the question of loss and damage. Who has to pay for that? Yeah? Who has to compensate the countries and the societies which have already experienced a severe loss and severe damages in their ecosystems, in their infrastructures because of climate change? This is also a North-South issue. This is also an issue where the global south demands compensation, demands a major contribution by the global northern countries. So we can observe rising eco-imperial tensions in the course of the environmental crisis, of the aggravation of the environmental crisis, and the increasing precariousness of the imperial mode of living. How do states, how do political forces, how do social forces try to cope with these tendencies? That is my third and last point: competing crisis strategies and perspectives of a socio-ecological transformation. I would distinguish between three strategies. The first one is an ecological modernization of the imperial mode of living. This is something that we can observe, for example, in Europe with the European Green Deal that was launched in 2019. Right now it is under attack, one could say, because other priorities have climbed and have reached the top of the political agenda. Armament, for example, and digitalization. Nevertheless, ecological modernization and decarbonization are still top priorities. They are about eco-efficiency, that is making products more eco-efficient, shaping products in a way that less resources are used for their production and use, and that less emissions are produced when they are generated and when they are consumed. It is also about consistency, that is about a change of the resource base. Circular economy is an important keyword here. The electric automobility, if you want so, is an attempt to contribute to consistency, because the idea is to change the resource base of automobility. no longer shall automobility be based on the use of fossil fuels, but on the use of renewable energies, electricity that ideally is produced via renewable energies and not via burning fossil fuels. Ecological modernization is about a market and technological fix of the ecological crisis. It shall be reached via market incentives, via technological innovations. Yeah. Of course, we need technological innovation, but the problem is that we always run danger of a progress in the wrong object, as the German environmental sociologist Josef Huber has called it. Yeah. Is it really possible to replace the fossil automobility by an electric automobility? Does it make sense to put all the efforts on a transport transition, ecological transition of transport into electric automobility, or at least the main efforts? Yeah? Or isn't automobility as such the problem? That would be an example for progress in the wrong object. Don't we have to overcome the car-centered transport system? That is a question that is not raised in the ecological modernization debate. In contrast, this debate is largely directed towards modernizing consumption and production patterns without challenging them themselves. Efficiency gains may be compensated by economic growth. So the idea of ecological modernization is to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation and resource use. Is that possible? Many ecological economists doubt this. They say the technological advancements would have been that high that it has not been experienced in history before. It's not imaginable. So there might be an improvement, but this improvement might even lead to a larger resource use and larger environmental impacts because of the so-called rebound effect. A certain product gets cheaper, or it's cheaper to produce it, and because of an increase in ecological efficiency, and because of getting cheaper, the amount as it is produced and consumed increases, so that the individual unity is more ecologically efficient. But this ecological efficiency is overcompensated by a growing production and demand for this product. So furthermore, ecological modernization is about a shift rather than a stop or prevention of socio-ecological cause. Look at electric automobility. It is a shift from fossil fuels, which are still used, also for the production of cars, not so much in the use of cars if the electricity is produced with renewable energies. But what we need in order to produce the batteries for electric cars are metals like lithium that is imported from Chile. And this lithium, as we know, or its extraction is very water intensive, and it threatens to undermine the living conditions of peasants in the north of Chile and in other regions where this extraction takes place. That would be one of the competing strategies that we can observe right now. The second one could be called an authoritarian stabilization of the imperial mode of living. This is what has been gaining strength more recently. It is the project of the right, of the extreme right, of the authoritarian right, but also of some forces of the political center. It utilizes the crisis of ecological modernization. It utilizes difficulties to implement ecological modernization in a way that this seems to be attractive for many people. In Germany, we have currently experienced the end of a coalition or political coalition that had intended to ecologically modernize the German economy. That was one of the main targets of this coalition, but they failed. They failed with developing an attractive alternative, an alternative that would have been able to mobilize social majorities for an ecological modernization. They didn't manage to combine ecological modernization to with the let's say fight against social inequality. And it is here where the right steps in. They argue that ecological modernization is unjust, and so we should go on with producing fossil fuel cars. We should go on with eating and producing large portions of meat. So we should go on with these very unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. That is what they propagate. That is how they try to use the failure and the shortcomings of an ecological modernization strategy. They furthermore challenge, they furthermore politicize the challenge of traditional identities. For example, of gender identities, of identities regarding citizenship and nationality. There have been some progresses in this regard in recent years. The feminist movement, the refugees movement, they have challenged traditional identities, but they also have contributed to disturb the people who are very familiar with these identities. A colleague from the US, Cara Degett, has written about the so-called petromasculinity. That is a fossil fuel identity, an identity that is based on using fossil fuel cars, on eating meat and having a fossil fuel intensive way of life. And that is closely connected to certain imaginaries of masculinity. And that has been challenged more recently. And now the right tries to roll this back. It promises that these traditional identities can be reinstalled, that they can be revitalized, they can be strengthened again. And obviously they are quite successful at doing so. They also exploit the lack of a progressive narrative. Many people cannot, do not believe any longer that the future will be better than the present. They cannot imagine because they feel something fundamentally is changing. And the right steps in. They say, okay, if the future is not better than the present, then let's go back to the past. Let's go back to that what was good, or that what seems to have been good from the present perspective. Let's reinstall these traditional role models of gender identities. Let's fight all that what has to do with queerness, with deviating with identities and forms of acting that deviate from the traditional, very repressive forms of identities. And let's go on with using fossil fuels. Of course, we know we cannot do that everywhere in the world, but therefore we have a restrictive policy vis-a-vis migrants, vis-a-vis other nations that try to compete, that try to catch up in the competition with the global north. That is what the right suggests. And what we also can see is a combination of these two strategies of an ecological modernization on the one hand and the authoritarian stabilization on the other hand. Look at European policies. On the one hand, it is about the European Green Deal, and on the other hand, it is about the very restrictive and repressive migration regime. So here the two elements, the authoritarian and the modernization, the ecological element, are combined with each other. The third strategy would be a fundamental socio-ecological transformation. That is the most difficult one, but obviously that is the one that we need. So let me close with some remarks on this strategy. What could be an element, what could be elements of such a strategy? To start with some abstract elements, one element would be sufficiency and ecological reflexivity. So we talked about the ecological modernization of the imperial mode of living, and so that it is about efficiency and consistency. Sufficiency goes much beyond that. Sufficiency does not only try to make products and production processes more ecologically efficient. It does not only try to change the resource base of the existing production and consumption patterns. Instead, it considers these production and consumption patterns and the very social structures on which they are based as the problem and tries to overcome them. For example, a car-centered infrastructure system, it has to be overcome via more collective modes of transport, a more regionalized and seasonal agricultural system, a deglobalization. Deglobalization was a demand from forces from the global south. Warden Beller from the Philippines developed this idea in the early 2000s in the course of the outer globalization movement. We need that today even more urgently than we needed it in more than 20 years ago. So let's talk about sufficiency and ecological reflexivity. That is, how can we shape the metabolism between society and nature in a way that the reproductive necessities of both human and non-human nature are taken account of. That would be one element. Another element would be use value orientation and the logic of care. The capitalist economy is an economy that is not directed to the satisfaction of human needs. Satisfaction of human needs is only a side effect. The main driver of the capitalist economy is to make profit. And only those things are produced which promise to maximize the profit of capitalists. Of course, commodities, capitalist commodities also need to have a use value, otherwise they won't be sold. They need to satisfy a certain demand, a certain social demand. But often this demand does not exist prior to the products. Instead, it is created after the products and the technologies for their production have been developed. That is the task of marketing. Developing, creating a need for a product which nobody needed before, but which now is there and has to be sold. Of course, there are a lot of interesting and important new products that have been created. Nevertheless, there is also a lot of products that could be dispensable, that we do not necessarily need for a good life, or that even create ecological and social damage when they are produced and consumed. That is not an issue in capitalist economies. As soon as you can make profit with the product, and as long as it is not prohibited to produce them and to use them, you do that because you can make profit out of it. Look at the fossil fuel industry. BP, that renamed itself into Beyond Petroleum 5 years ago, now has announced to reduce its so-called clean energy investments significantly in order to expand the investments in fossil fuels. We all know that it is catastrophic, that we cannot afford to do that, but it promises profits in the short term, and so they do it. This is capitalism, and this is why we have to question these capitalist production and consumption patterns more fundamentally, and to reimagine the economy from the point of view of a logic of care. This is a demand of feminist economists and feminist social scientists, putting the economy from the head to its feet. That is, evaluating these systems and these activities that are really important for our social and physical reproduction. Social infrastructures like hospitals, care facilities, and schools, universities, technical infrastructures like public transport, renewable energy provision, water provision, and so on. These are the social spheres on which our good life depends, and not that what is considered the official economy where surplus value production is taking place. Often there a lot of things are produced that are harmful or that do not have a social use value. That would be the second point. And the third point is radical democracy and equality. All the 3 points are closely connected. We need radical democracy radical democracy is basically equality. It means nothing else than everybody who is affected by a certain decision shall have the chance to equally participate in the decision-making process. If we take that serious, then many things that are produced right now would have to be stopped directly. For example, nuclear power or extracting coal and other fossil fuels. Because using these damage people worldwide who do not have any chance to participate in the decision-making process, not to speak from benefiting from the use of the products. And it also damages people in a timely, in a time scale, future generations, which cannot be involved in the decision-making process today, but nevertheless have to bear the cost of the decisions that are taken today. So we have to think about radical democracy and equality in order to transform the economy in a way that the use value is prioritized over the exchange value. The question of sufficiency is a question of democracy. It cannot be answered by the market here. The market can perhaps answer questions of ecological efficiency and consistency. We saw that before, but it cannot answer questions of ecological sufficiency. That is something that has to be democratically decided. We have to initiate discussions about legitimate social needs. Otherwise, I think it will be difficult to cope with the escalating climate crisis. Now, this sounds very abstract, but it's not abstract in the sense that it is something that intellectuals have developed sitting at a desk, but these principles are implications of many struggles of progressive social movements worldwide. If we look at struggles on energy democracy, on social infrastructures, on food sovereignty, on housing, on mobility, then we will see that these principles are inherent in these struggles. And I think the challenge is to strengthen such struggles, to think about their generalizability and to explore. That is, I think, something very important for us as academics, to explore the conditions, how they can be generalized and how they can be generalized very quickly, because we, as we know, do not have so much time to cope with the climate crisis any longer. We have to enact radical changes in a very short time scale. Many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So thank you very much for a very interesting talk, Marcus. I think what I would like to do is just perhaps pose, let's say, an opening question, and then a little bit of a discussion, and then I'll open up let's say, your presentation to the rest of us. So I wanted to ask, and this is maybe let's say a question about the methodology and kind of social action. So let's say the approach that you take is let's say an approach. Okay, let's just use a kind of more neutral term, a kind of critical theory approach. But the approach of critical theory is also very much connected to let's say an impetus for the transformation of what you're analysing, isn't it?
Sorry, I didn't get this last point. The critical theory approach is connected to
yeah. So when you have let's say you have a critical theory which is revealing, let's say, the negative and oppressive characteristics of this, let's say, global situation.
Now we
it's connected to an impetus for social transformation, isn't it?
if it is connected to a narrative of social transformation.
Yeah, an impetus for social transformation.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I would say it depends on the part of critical of the theoretical tradition to which one refers. Yeah. We, with our approach, see ourselves in a tradition of a critical theory, or let's say a certain notion, a critical theoretical notion that has been used by various authors. Yeah, Rosa Luxemburg certainly is one of them, with a revolutionary realpolitik, or Ernst Bloch is somebody who one could mention here. More recently, Joachim Hirsch, a German political scientist, and in particular, Eric Olin Wright, with his notion of real utopias, has used this idea of a transition, of a transformation. The basic idea is the same. The basic idea is that we have to start from the concrete contradictions and needs of people, but that we have to formulate the concrete political measures and the reforms in a way that they are both shaped in a way that they contribute to improving the living conditions of people, and therefore are able to mobilize majorities, and are radical in a way that this cannot simply be integrated into into a capitalist business as usual. We all know that that capitalism is a very flexible mode of production, that is able to integrate incentives, that it is able to integrate a critique and to transform this critique into an impetus of its own modernization. So the question is how to formulate a critique. Is it possible to formulate a critique that is both very concrete and can be realized under the existing conditions, but at the same time radical insofar that it addresses and overcomes certain basic structures or back mechanisms of the capitalist mode of production? I will give you an example. I live in Berlin, and 4 years ago we had a referendum in Berlin. So Berlin is not only a city, but it's also a federal state in Germany. It has a constitution, and within this federal state constitution, it is possible to initiate a referendum. And we had an initiative that said we have a housing crisis. The rents are exploding. Many people cannot afford to pay the rents any longer. What can we do? The initiative said we do not tolerate that housing as a basic social infrastructure is driven by the principle to create profit out of it. It's driven by investors, by big housing companies who are not interested in offering decent housing for people, for ordinary people, but who are just interested in extracting profit out of the housing sector of a booming metropolis. This initiative said we are going to change that, and we are going to initiate a referendum that is about the disappropriation of the big housing companies. And this referendum was very successful. It found the support of 59% of the Berlin electorate. So 59% of the voters in Berlin said, yes, we want the disappropriation of the big housing companies in order to put the housing issue under the logic of, let's say, of a universal basic service, and to shape it in a way that is affordable for everybody. That is a radical reform. That is a reform that's very concrete, because it would improve the living conditions of many people directly, and therefore it was possible to organize a majority for that. And it is radical because it addresses the capitalist property relations, so a basic institution of this society. So that would be an example for this. And of course there are other examples. We don't have to talk about the development of this initiative, but that would be just an example for, let's say, a critical theoretical approach on notion of transformation.
Thank you very much. Right. So I will open up your very interesting presentation to the others. So if you have a question, please go ahead. Yeah, Ida, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting for me. I wanted to talk about the aspect that you very well explained of the externalization of the socio-ecological costs by the imperial mode of living and the tensions this creates, especially in relation to the what you called the ecological modernization strategy, since it also comes from my research interests that are related to the struggles against hydropower projects in the Balkan region. You also mentioned the issue of the extractivism of lithium, which we also have this problem in the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia as well. So where would you put this? Sometimes you talked about contradictions, but I would wonder whether we could call this actually the inherent power relations that we have in the imperial mode of living, where also the costs of the ecological transitions are externalized to some specific territories and populations. Another issue and question that I would like to pose, related again to this critique to an imperial mode of living and therefore the imperialism that brings wars around the globe. So especially today, where would we put the war in this whole debate and critique, and whether should we also connect a strategy that, as you said, has stances of radical democracy and socio-ecological development? Should we also put a very strict anti-war stance in this, as we have seen, like the war that Israel is conducting on Gaza has, apart from the whole humanitarian and ethical issues, has produced 60 millions of tons of CO2 emissions. So it also brings an impact and an enhancing of the ecological and climate crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks for these very good questions. The first one on the externalization, yeah, you are completely right. Yeah, so we would say that an ecological modernization of the imperial mode of living produces other forms of externalization necessities. Yeah. That is quite clear. Yeah, it does not overcome the need to externalize. It would perhaps shift the externalization spatially and regarding the resources, but it wouldn't overcome that. Yeah. When we talk about externalization or external effects, there is a certain tradition to talk about that. That is the neoclassical environmental economics. Yeah, they talk about external effects, and their idea is to overcome these external effects via internalizing them through the market and the price mechanism. Yeah, and if you want, so you can argue, okay, through electric automobility, we are going to internalize the external effects of a car-centered transport system. Yeah, but what happens? Yeah, what happens is that new, different external effects are created. Even the old ones will not stop. Yeah, because how do we produce these cars? Yeah, what kind of resources are used for the production? Yeah, how do we create all the electricity that is needed in the car companies and the car production processes? This electricity is largely produced by burning fossil fuels. So it's not even a replacement. It is something, yeah, we have new external effects that are added to the old ones. Yeah. So there is this idea to internalize external effects, yeah, which is, it is highly problematic, not only for this reason, but it doesn't work. So two feminist scholars from Germany, Uta von Winterfeld and Adelaide Biesecker, have called it externalization as a principle. Yeah? Externalization is a principle of capitalist economies. Yeah? If we try to internalize certain external effects, we are going to produce other ones, or we are going to add new ones to the already existing external effects, and we never will be able to overcome this principle. Yeah? That would be the first point. The second point that you raised on imperialism, war, and the emission, yeah, that is a very important point, yeah, because we know that the military, even if it is not in war, produce a lot of emissions, yeah. The emissions emerge when producing the equipment for the military, when they practice, and so on, yeah. And when they are in war, it is even much worse, yeah. So stopping war and fighting against militarism is a very important precondition also to condemn the ecological crisis. Yeah? That is very, very difficult, we know. Yeah, and here we see also a very close connection of the imperial mode of living and the war tendency. Look at the relationship between Russia and the European Union. Yeah? The European Union, Germany in particular, has for a long time relied on Russian gas exports. In importing gas and oil from Russia, it has contributed to strengthening a certain extractivism oligarchy in Russia and to stabilize the regime by Vladimir Putin that now has attacked Ukraine. Yeah. In other, we cannot always, I don't want to be monocausal and find only an ecological reason for the existing conflicts. Yeah. I think particularly the war of Israel against Gaza is more complex, so that we cannot find a major ecological driver here. Yeah. But nevertheless, every war has an ecological dimension. Every war also has to be seen against the background of aggravating tensions for resources, for the stabilization, for the authoritarian stabilization of an imperial mode of living. And these eco-imperial tensions that I mentioned as a result of the crisis of the imperial mode of living, of course, they also imply the danger of weaponized conflicts. Yeah? And it is a contribution to prevent these conflicts, to overcome this imperial mode of living, and to care for a completely different economy. We know it's difficult. It's difficult. We need this economy very quickly, but it's complex to achieve it. But nevertheless, there are movements, and we have to strengthen that movement. I think there is no alternative to think from these movements from below about their institutionalization, their strengthening, their fighting against what is actually happening. Maybe one last remark, and it also refers to your question, but also to the one Peter raised before. I think Eric Allen-White, whom I mentioned, has, if you want so, conceptualized a threefold transformation strategy that consists of three elements. The one is an interstitial strategy, the other one is a strategy of symbiosis, and the third one is a strategy of rupture. Yeah. The interstitial strategy is a strategy that creates new alternatives from below and aside of the existing system. Yeah. So if you want so, organic agriculture, yeah, or solidarity agriculture and other forms of housing and so on. Yeah. It's interstitial. Yeah. It is important. It does not suffice. Yeah. We also need other strategies. That is a strategy of symbiosis, that is working in the existing institutions and trying to expand what is possible in the existing institutions. And we always also have to think about a rupture, about a break with what is happening. Yeah. How can we initiate interstitial and symbiotic reforms in a way that they prepare a rupture, that they prepare a break? Because we also need this rupture. This is very difficult, very complicated, but nevertheless, we have to think about it. It is an intellectual, an academic, and also a political task and challenge.
Okay, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation. I was wondering, since you invoked Eric Olin Wright and his concept of real utopias, my question would be less theoretical and more practical in a way, or empirical. And what are some examples that you are inspired by and you think might be working towards overcoming the imperial mode of living and creating some new hegemonies on the ground that could question this imperial mode of living? And then the other question would be, I'm not sure I fully understood you. You did mention nuclear energy at some point, but I think you mentioned it in a negative light. And I was wondering if you could clarify your position and if nuclear energy is also, even though it does not emit CO2, and if it is negative, what are some acceptable forms of energy from your perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Yeah. On the question of nuclear energy, I'm a strong opponent of nuclear energy. Yeah? I know that it's contested even in the environmental movement, Andreas Malm or Matthew Huber, and so intellectuals of radical intellectuals, they have articulated themselves in favor of nuclear energy. But I think that first creates loads and dangers that cannot be controlled. Yeah? It's simply too dangerous, and it creates a load for future generations that simply cannot be managed. Yeah? It creates loads, it shrinks the room of autonomous decision-making of future generations in a way that is not responsible. Yeah? It's dangerous in the way that accidents never can be precluded. I know that we always talk about new technologies, these, I don't know the English word, these new type of reactors, which still is not in a state that it can be applied. Yeah? And the old reactors simply need too much time in order to be constructed. Yeah? How much time does it cost to create a nuclear reactor? It's enormously time consuming. And at times you would have been able to create thousands of wind wheels and solar power stations, which would have contributed to overcoming the energy crisis. Yeah. That is one point. The second point is, if we talk about sufficiency, then the question of energy and even nuclear energy is also a different question, or it's posed differently. Yeah. So talking about nuclear energy and the need to do and to install and develop new nuclear power facilities, and starts from the assumption that we need ever more energy, or that we have to transform our fossil fuel-based energy in a way that it becomes clean and does not emit CO2 any longer. But do we really need all these processes for which we consume energy at the moment? Yeah, I think that is a implicit precondition of thinkers like Matthew Huber, for example. He criticizes the degrowth movement. Yeah, for him, less is a problem. Yeah, but I think we can afford less, and we can even increase the quality of life for many people when we do and produce less. There is no need for produce SUVs. There is no need for producing so many cars. Yeah, and if we reduce that, then I think there will not be a need to talk about nuclear power any longer. That would be my answer to your second question. Your first question was about Eric Olin Wright and a more practical example. Yeah, the example that I gave when I responded to Peter's question is a practical example. You know? So this idea of an initiative that fights the housing crisis via the disappropriation of big housing companies. Yeah. That would be such a radical reformism or real utopia. It is real because it is very concrete. It is utopian because it addresses capitalist property relations at a very decisive point, yeah, in a very decisive sector, in a sector on which we all depend. To give you another example, yeah, and that is more that relates to the transport system. I argue with examples from Berlin, which are most familiar to me, but of course there are also other examples worldwide, and Ida mentioned the protest against lithium extraction on the Balkan. I think these are also extractions that, these are also protests that confront the certain capitalist rationality and try to safeguard autonomous spaces, spaces of self-determination, spaces of creating other forms or keeping the horizons for other forms of economies open. Yeah. Another example in Berlin would be a mobility issue. Yeah, Eric Olin Wright, besides this threefold transformation strategy, talked about two things that have to come together. Yeah. The first one is a change in everyday practices, and the second one is the politicization of a certain state that should be overcome. Yeah. In Berlin, there is an initiative that combines these two factors. Yeah. What we can observe on the streets of Berlin is that there are ever more bikers. Yeah. And there are official countings. Yeah. Ever more bikers passing through the city. Yeah. But there is an infrastructure that is not appropriate for biking. Yeah. It's a car-centered infrastructure. There's a systematic disadvantage for bikers everywhere, nearly everywhere in the city. Yeah. Now there is an initiative that is called Changing Cities that pursues the goal to change this infrastructure. So you can see that two elements here come together. Yeah? The change of everyday practices and an initiative that politicizes the obstacles towards this change. Yeah? And these two initiatives, these two sides are self-reinforcing. They are self-reinforcing in a way that they create a pressure. They create a pressure that has to be used in a way that is both symbiotic and ruptural, yeah, to use these other terms by Eric Olin Wright. Yeah. On the one hand, we have these interstitial activities, yeah, arising significance of biking and in everyday practices. Yeah. And we have symbiotic initiatives by Changing Cities, that is, are acting in the institutions in order to overcome the obstacles, and is also preparing a rupture with the car-centered infrastructure system, because the implications of this strategy are very wide, they are very far-reaching. Yeah? If these initiatives are successful, then car traffic will change fundamentally. And it's not just an initiative in Berlin, but also in other German cities and in cities worldwide. Yeah. And that is a very important thing, because it addresses the ecological crisis in an area where in the last years very little has happened here. So if you look at the CO2 emissions in the transport sector, they have not decreased. They have either stagnated or even increased. Yeah. And coping with climate change also has to start here with radical measures against the car-centered transport system.
Are there any other questions? So, Tina, how much time do we have left? Are we done? 5 minutes or something, even less probably, right?
Yeah, around 15 minutes, but it's fine if there's no questions.
Right. So maybe Marcus, I could ask the final question if no one else wants to kind of jump in and ask a question, and that's kind of really this kind of question of solidarity, because this seems to be quite a central part of this kind of project, doesn't it? And I want to ask also, because this question of solidarity is because of the kind of character of the project. It's also one of internationalism, isn't it? Too. So I mean, it's not a. I mean, it's a. You know, let's say you are thinking of solidarity at many different levels, aren't you? That is correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're completely right. At different levels, and of course, the international solidarity is a very important aspect. Yeah, we can also so we have international solidarity, intergenerational solidarity. Yeah, I think these are, if you want, so solidarities in space and solidarities in time. Yeah? solidarity with the future generations, yeah, which inherit our inherit living conditions to which generation they have not contributed, yeah, and solidarity in space, that is solidarity with people who are affected by the production and consumption patterns of northern countries, in particular of the elites of northern countries. Yeah. So the imperial mode of living is a class issue, obviously. Yeah. That would be one form of distinguish different forms of solidarity. And then a second form to distinguish, to differentiate solidarities is to distinguish between an explicit and structural solidarity. Yeah? An explicit solidarity would be, for example, an act of solidarizing oneself with the people fighting for their rights in other parts of the world. Yeah. Yeah, I think there are many parts, yeah, in the world where that is necessary. Yeah. So yesterday I sent a declaration in favor of academics and students in Serbia who currently are fighting for their rights and against the repressive and authoritarian governments and the often violent repression that they face. Yeah. That would be an explicit solidarity. Yeah. There can be yeah, expressed by individuals, but also by social movements. Look at the solidarity, the international solidarity campaigns in the 1970s in favor of Chile after the coup with the people who were suppressed by the militaries, or with the Nicaraguan revolution from 1979 onwards, and so on. Yeah, today with other people oppressed everywhere in the world. Yeah, that would be an explicit solidarity, but there is also a structural solidarity. So if we transform our modes of production and consumption in a way that they do not produce social and environmental costs any longer, that is also a solidarity. Yeah? That means we inscribe solidarity into the infrastructures, into the institutions, into the ways how we produce and consume. Yeah? We inscribe that, and thereby we do not produce harms for other people any longer and allow them to self-determine what they want to do and how they want to develop. Yeah. That would be a structural form of solidarity that would need major transformations, particularly in the countries of the global north.
Okay. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much indeed for an extremely interesting talk, and for let's say the discussion also, which is very interesting too. And also to say, I think, well, to everybody, well, we will see each other, I mean, apart from Marcus, obviously, in CRES. But thank you very much again, Marcus, for a very interesting talk.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, for the very good contributions and questions and the comments in the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, and
Bye.
see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.